He was, for a brief moment in history, the richest man in the entire world. He had clawed his way up from nothing. From a childhood so poor his family had crossed an ocean just to escape starvation. And he had built an empire of steel so vast that the modern world was, quite literally, constructed out of it. And then, at the height of it all, he did something that made almost no sense to the men around him. He set out deliberately and urgently to give the whole fortune away, not to leave it to his family, not to build a dynasty, to empty his own hands of nearly every dollar before he died, because he had come to believe something startling about what a great fortune actually meant. This is the story of the ruthless man who conquered steel and then spent his final years desperately trying to get rid of the money he had fought so hard to win. Because power and money are never far apart. His name was Andrew Carnegie. And to understand why a man would try to give away the greatest fortune of his age, you first have to see how brutally hard he worked to build it. He was born in a tiny cottage in Scotland in the 1830s into real poverty. His father was a weaver whose trade was destroyed by the arrival of machines, and the family sank from poor to desperate until they scraped together the money to sail to America in search of any life at all. Young Andrew was still a boy, barely into his teens, when he took his first job in a cotton mill, working brutal hours for almost nothing. But here is the first thing to understand about him. Even as a penniless child laborer, Carnegie was watching, learning, and climbing. He taught himself. He read every book he could reach. And he had a gift for making himself useful to powerful men, for being the sharpest, most eager young person in any room. That gift carried him upward with astonishing speed. He talked his way into a job as a telegraph messenger, then became a skilled telegraph operator, and there he was, noticed by an important man in the railroad business who took him under his wing. Under that mentor, Carnegie learned how the biggest industries of the age truly worked, how money moved, how deals were made, and, crucially, how to invest. He began putting his small savings into the right companies at the right moments, and slowly, a poor immigrant boy started to become a wealthy man. But wealth was not enough for Carnegie. He had seen where the future was heading, and he was about to place one enormous bet on a single material that would build the modern world. That material was steel. Carnegie understood earlier and more clearly than almost anyone that the coming age would be built out of steel: the railroads, the bridges, the towering buildings, the machines. And he understood something else that would make him unimaginably rich, that if he could produce steel more cheaply than anyone else on Earth, he would win everything. So he became obsessed, ferociously obsessed, with efficiency. He adopted every new method that could lower the cost of making steel. He drove his mills to produce more, faster, cheaper, relentlessly. He watched every expense, and he built his empire so that he controlled as much of the process as possible, from the raw materials in the ground to the finished steel leaving his mills. It was one of the most efficient industrial machines the world had ever seen, and it made him fabulously, overwhelmingly wealthy. But that efficiency, and this is the honest shadow we cannot skip, came at a heavy human cost. The men who actually made Carnegie's steel worked long, dangerous, punishing hours in extreme heat for wages that were squeezed as tightly as every other cost in his empire. And when those workers tried to organize, to demand better pay and safer conditions, the conflict could turn genuinely ugly. In one infamous episode at one of his major steelworks, a bitter dispute between the company and its workers erupted into a deadly clash, and lives were lost. Carnegie himself was far away in Scotland at the time, and he let his ruthless business partner handle it. But the events left a permanent stain on his name, and a hard question hanging over everything that followed. The man who would later be celebrated as one of history's great givers had built his fortune in part on the backs of workers he pushed to the very edge. Both of these things are true, and the story is dishonest if it hides either one. Then, in the very first year of the 20th century, Carnegie did something that stunned the business world. He sold his entire steel empire. The buyer was the famous banker who was assembling the largest corporation the world had ever seen. and the price was so staggering that it made Carnegie, overnight, the richest man on the planet. He walked away from the mills, the furnaces, the endless fight, holding a fortune almost beyond comprehension. Most men, having reached that summit, would have spent the rest of their lives simply enjoying it, or building a great dynasty to pass it all down through the generations. Carnegie did the opposite. And to understand why, you have to know about an idea he had been quietly wrestling with for years, because power and money are never far apart. Sometime before, Carnegie had written down a philosophy that would define the rest of his life, a set of beliefs about wealth that were genuinely radical for a man of his position. He argued that a rich man who dies still holding his fortune has, in a sense, failed and disgraced himself. He believed that enormous wealth was not something to be hoarded or handed down to spoil one's children, but a public trust, something the wealthy person was morally obligated to give back to society within their own lifetime, thoughtfully, to lift others up. The man who had squeezed every penny out of steel had come to believe that hoarding those pennies, in the end, was a kind of sin. And having sold his empire, he now had one final enormous project left: to live up to his own philosophy before his time ran out. And so Andrew Carnegie began to give on a scale the world had rarely seen. But he did not simply hand out money at random. True to his nature, he gave strategically, aiming his fortune at things he believed would help people lift themselves, exactly as he had lifted himself. Above all, he loved libraries, because as a poor boy, free access to books had been his own ladder out of poverty. So he funded the building of libraries, not a handful, but thousands of them, spread across town after town, so that any poor child anywhere might do what he had done. He poured money into education, into universities and schools and scientific research. He funded a great concert hall whose name is still famous today. He built institutions devoted to advancing knowledge and even to promoting peace between nations. By the end of his life, he had given away the overwhelming majority of his colossal fortune, hundreds of millions of dollars, an amount that in today's money would be staggering. Now, in fairness, we should hold the whole man in view, because honesty demands it. Some have argued that Carnegie's giving was, in part, an attempt to clean his own conscience, to buy back a reputation stained by the way he had treated his workers. There is surely something to that. A river of charity does not erase the hard hours and the lost lives in the mills. But it is also true that the good his giving did was vast and real, and continues to this day. The libraries educated generations. The institutions still function. Millions of lives were genuinely touched for the better by a man trying, however imperfectly, to answer for his fortune. He was neither a simple villain nor a simple saint. He was a complicated, driven man who did real harm building his empire and real good dismantling it, and both are part of the truth. And that is the uncomfortable question folded into his story, one that echoes straight into our own time. We watch the great fortunes of today, the enormous piles of wealth, and we argue about what their owners owe the rest of us, whether giving some of it back can ever balance how it was earned. Carnegie faced that same question more than 100 years ago, and he answered it in the most dramatic way he could. He decided that a man who dies rich dies disgraced, and he spent his final years racing to empty his own hands. Whether that made him a hero or simply a guilty man buying peace is a question people still argue about today. But he understood, better than almost anyone, the strange truth at the heart of it all: that building a fortune and answering for it are two very different battles. Because power and money are never far apart. Discovery continues.